Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the second album from the Orb, U.F.Orb. Alright then, now with a classic double album under their belts that proved the grand vision of the Orb to a wider audience, they followed it up with a project that went all the way to #1 on the UK album charts. The first and last time they would pull that off. U.F.Orb is pretty similar to what they did on their debut. Instead of being generally themed around space, it's now specifically on aliens and UFOs. Completely different. And a lot of the same people that worked on the debut also show up here again. System 7, Youth, and Thomas Fellman all return. Though Chris Weston now had a far more pronounced role. He was now a full-time member who contributed in a very direct musical capacity to every single track, and arguably was the main driving force behind this album. Now, admittedly, of the OG trilogy of Orb albums with Chris Weston still on board, U.F.Orb is my personal least favorite. I think both Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld and Orbis Terrarum capture even more of a sense of impressive, well-detailed expansiveness, the former having more iconic standouts for me, and the latter going into more interesting and experimental territory than this one does. But U.F.Orb is still just as much of a classic as those two projects, with several of their most easily recognizable tracks and pretty much no major weak points to speak of. You're still gonna get your fill of top-tier ambient house, techno, and dub material that no one but the Orb could have possibly come up with. I do think the album does start on a bit of an odd, non-indicative note with OOBE, co-produced by Fellman. A track that I never used to be all that big into when I was first getting into these guys in high school, but has actually been a grower as of fairly recently. When I first saw this track, I thought its title was some kind of fake acronym meant to conjure up imagery of like some kind of alien goo derived from Oobe or something, and like a weird roundabout way of bookending the album, which ends in 49 seconds of weird alien goo sound effects. Though soon afterwards I found out that the title actually stands for Out-of-Body Experience, which made a lot more sense and was a lot more fitting for what the track actually sounded like. Lots of sparse but expansive mixes of ambient pads, synth choirs, blipping keyboard progressions that come in later on to really help establish that alien atmosphere. A rambling philosophical monologue about objective contents of thoughts. Meandering flute performances from Tom Green. All of it fits together really well and creates this really alluring and relaxed but mysterious and intriguing vibe that can live up to its title. That said, as much as this track has grown on me recently, I do still think it does make for like a bit of a slow start to this album and really sticks out like a sore thumb in this album's track listing. Most of the other moments here go for a much more energetic ambient techno sort of approach. Like the title track here is where this project really starts to kick into gear and show what it's really all about. Well, it starts with a mysterious intro that carries out of the opener pretty well in its mix of radio announcers and wavering ambient chords. It eventually breaks into this much more danceable beat and one heck of a grooving bass line provided by Guy Pratt, and all these surprisingly catchy but dissonant progressions of synth chords that really add to that otherworldly alien mood the whole album creates. It's a total banger and was an instant favorite of mine when I first heard this project. Honestly, I kind of feel like it would have made for a more fitting opener than the one we got, but it is what it is. Anyway, next we get Blue Room, the album's biggest single and arguably its centerpiece, named after a rumored room in an Air Force base that was supposed to contain evidence of UFOs or something. It's also a bit of a notable record breaker in its own right. The original single version of this track stretches on for a whopping 40 minutes, and I believe is the longest track to have ever charted on the UK singles charts to this day. Featuring contributions from System 7, including Steve Hillage's own feedback-heavy experimental guitar work, bass lines from Ja Wobble, samples from Mad Professor, and vocals from Aisha the High Priestess. And the original version is pretty cool, though this 17-minute album edit will do in a pinch. Certainly much easier to get through and doesn't sacrifice the expansiveness of the original. Actually manages to fit a lot of ideas in its running time and keeps changing and evolving as it goes on. Starts out with a sea of blipping synths and ambient washes, splashing water sound effects and tapping rhythms, switch-ups into more structured variations on the same mixes of sounds that have more energy and groove to them, mysterious vocal passages and eventually proper dance beats about 9 minutes in, and finally a proper bass line a little after the 10-minute mark. And despite the variety of sounds on display throughout, all of it just feels like one seamless build-up. Every sound perfectly leads into the next. Like you're just watching a giant structure slowly rise out of an expansive ocean of ambience. It's pretty epic, though I'll admit even this track was not an immediate favorite either. In high school, this track could pretty consistently put me to sleep, but it did really click with me once I was able to give it my full attention and wrap my head around how much this track gives you to explore. As a side note, while we're on the topic of singles related to this album, I should also recommend the B-side on the Blue Room single called Assassin, which eventually got released as a single in its own right and charted almost just as well by itself. I think tacking that track onto this album would lead to it getting a bit overstuffed, but sonically it would have fit perfectly into this album's lineup. Another spacey techno banger that's absolutely worth seeking out. The 15-minute Oasis of Rhythms mix is the one I'm most used to listening to, keeps that iconic main groove intact while letting it meander along in that typical classic Orb way that you'd hope for. Definitely an essential listen for any longtime Orb fans, if they somehow have missed it. But getting back to this album, the next track is Towers of Dub, which, like the opener, was co-produced by Thelman and is also a bit of an outlier in terms of its sound. As far as I can tell, this track has absolutely no connection to the alien theme of the album. It's trying to go for a super straightforward dub reggae groove that somewhat contrasts with the more ambient techno-centric sound of the rest of the album. And also starts with like a sample of a prank phone call in which comedian Victor Lewis Smith, I guess, pretends to be Marcus Garvey and tries to set up a meeting with Haile Selassie, both of whom I believe were dead at the time. And as far as I can tell is being included here because this particular track is so heavily Jamaican inspired. Goofy head-scratcher intro aside, Towers of Dub is almost certainly my favorite track on the album, and quite possibly my favorite, just straight dub track of all time. At least it's the track that will most quickly come to my mind whenever I think about dub music in general. And sure, I'll admit you can take that with a grain of salt to some degree, since I don't listen to a lot of the original Jamaican dub reggae music from artists like Lee Scratch Perry and all those. But when I think of dub, this is the exact mix of sounds that I think of. Deep bass lines, those instantly recognizable thumping and plotting beats, dusty organ chords on the offbeats in many sections, all those awesome harmonica solos from Marnie Pax and echoing voice samples all over the place, basically every sonic element being echoed in that exact way as that you get out of classic dub music. Just keeps thumping along for 15 minutes and that groove never gets old. The Orb sound in general has always been really indebted towards the traditions of Jamaican dub music. See Perpetual Dawn again for the other most obvious example, as well as the way that they use that echoing effect on their voice samples on pretty much all their other albums up through present day. But I feel like a track like this shows that they've done their best to take those influences in as genuine and authentic a manner as they can. Despite the goofy samples that show up throughout this track and the more playful vibe of the whole thing, those Jamaican influences are not being played for a joke. They're emulating these sounds because they think they kick ass in their own right, and the result is absolutely epic. Towers of Dub deserves to have become such a big, iconic mainstay in the Orb catalog, and is one of my favorite moments from them in general. But going back into techno territory, we move on to Close Encounters, which is a collab with Slam, aka Ord Makel and Stuart McMillan, and is the most straightforward techno cut in the bunch. This was a big favorite when I first stirred it, and my thoughts haven't fundamentally changed since then. Not much to say about it beyond it holding up the same spacey atmosphere most of the rest of the album goes for, and containing a particularly strong banging groove that can carry most of the track on its own in spite of its relative simplicity. Also featuring a kinda neat 2-minute ambient outro with some mysterious mumbling singer in the background tacked on at the end, I guess. Sounds pretty similar to the Assassin single, and while I'm not sure if it's as well remembered as that track, it hits equally as hard and is just as much of an adrenaline rush. Definite favorite there. And then finally, the album closes with Majestic, featuring co-production from Youth, which I also quite like, though isn't as big a favorite as Close Encounters. Where that track was a lot darker and more driving and focused, this track takes a lot of those similar techno beats and applies them to a much breezier and more lighthearted mix. It features this cheery but repetitive synth riff as its hook running through much of it that on some listens is just a nice catchy earworm to tie the track together, but on other listens could get a bit grating depending on my mood. Still has as solid a groove behind it as everything else here, and has plenty of sounds floating past you and interesting diversions into flute samples, loops of harp notes, sung vocal snippets that sound like they say, "Go to sleep," or moments where the beats start playing in reverse and stuff like that. Still a really solid closer, though I don't know if it's necessarily the strongest possible note you could have gone out on. And the above-mentioned 40 seconds of squelchy sound effects, aka sticky end, is kind of a nondescript addition to the project as well. It's just kind of there. Honestly, not sure why that little segment was given an actual title instead of just being merged into Majestic. But, yeah, that's everything on U.F.Orb. I mean, I really don't have much to add about this one that I haven't already said. It's not the tightest or most well-paced entrance into the Orb catalog, but, I mean, pretty much every individual track on here has become an iconic moment from them, and are among their most easily recognizable work. It's already well cemented its place in history as a classic, just as their debut has. So, yeah, I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.